Welcome back to the Craftsman Online podcast. This is a weekly program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, Editor-in-Chief of CraftsmanOnline.com. I want to bring in my guest quick before we get into the topic, because this will explain some of the smile on my voice when I read the usual standard disclaimer to get our show started. But let's welcome worshipful brother Jason Marshall, who's the past master of... You got to help me how to pronounce your lodge, brother.
Veritas Lodge, number 556 in Norman, Oklahoma.
There we go. We don't get too many Veritas Lodge references here. The reason why I was smiling is because every time we do a podcast episode for Craftsman Online, I have to read that standard disclaimer. And most of the times, it doesn't really apply. But I have a feeling on this one. These are our own opinions and do not reflect anything that's been said or held by any of our Grand Lodges or any of those other concordant bodies. That's going to come into play because we're going to tackle one of the topics that we normally don't get into in Freemasonry, and that's the faith of acceptance. As you know, Freemasons, we do not discuss religion and politics inside during our lodge meetings, but I'll tell you what, the themes of religion as far as like history, as we're going to get into the biblical references, those certainly are relevant in the ritual in Freemasonry, and certainly a lot of our outside of lodge conversations with brothers do revolve around politics and religion. Brother Marshall is the author of a book called The Path, where he discusses the 7 major religions in the world and how they relate to ancient craft masonry. Before we get to that part of it, I always like to get into the backstory with our guests, and what I found interesting about your story is you're a practicing attorney in Oklahoma City who also has an interest in world religions and cultures, and you followed that through your college education. So how did all of this come together with you making those steps and making the 3 knocks to pursue the light in Freemasonry?
Oh, as a kid, I was always just a curious child. I grew up in the Nazarene Christian faith from a small town. So grew up in a Christian tradition, but was just always curious about world religions and whatnot. Usually once a year, Sunday school class would do some kind of comparative religion study. Now, generally speaking, it was more of how this particular religion is wrong and they need Jesus, but I was always just fascinated by these other traditions and religions. When I got to college, my bachelor's degree is in political science, but that department had a world studies, world religion studies as well. And so a lot of those classes, depending on which path of political science you wanted to take, would overlap. And so I took a lot of the comparative religion courses just out of just curiosity and interest. There was one class in particular, that professor was Dr. Greg Scott. It was a synopsis or a study of the 7 major world religions. And part of that class, you had to read major portions of the major texts for each religion. And you would write a short summary of that belief or that particular text. Well, at the end of the course, you had to write a thesis of your own, what you understand religion or God to be, essentially. And I remember as I started writing this paper, it was just very difficult because going in, I was going in on the, well, this is what these people believe, but they're wrong for these following reasons. And so I, for several weeks, tried to write this paper, from that viewpoint, that here's what this religion thinks, here's how they're wrong, and go on from there. But I could never finish it. I just kind of kept stuck on page 1, page 2, maybe page 3, trash it, start over. And finally, the night before that it was due, it just kind of crashed on me that you're coming at this wrong. I mean, why are you coming at studying these religions that they're wrong to begin with, right? I mean, can't there be more viewpoints of God than just the one particular faith that I grew up in, or the particular, denomination even of Christianity that I grew up in? Why is that the only correct way or viewpoint for God or for religion? I mean, if you take, to borrow a philosophical term as your first principle, that God created everyone and everything, that wouldn't God have shown himself to everyone in some form or fashion. So why is my one narrow slice or viewpoint of God the only correct way? It can't be. There's no way it can be. In 2000, I believe it was 13 or 14, I was lucky enough to go to DC for the Kala Chakra initiation with the Dalai Lama. And I remember one of the teachings that he brought up was that, if there is a God, and let's just say that you could actually see God, for example, and kind of like me holding my hand out, and I said, well, what do you see? Well, depending on your viewpoint, you're going to have wildly different views of what my hand is. If you're in front of me, you'll say, well, there's lines on the palm, there's these finger structures. Well, somebody else who may be behind me would say, well, no, you've got fingernails and maybe there's some hair on the back. Well, to the person in front, that's complete heresy. What are you talking about? No, there's no fingernails. There's no hair on it. I mean, you're completely incorrect. But sort of by studying religions, you kind of begin to see the different facets of God and create your own understanding of it. So back to that paper, I didn't finish it that night, and I ended up having to kind of tuck my tail between my legs and go into the professor's office and say, look, I haven't been putting this off. I've been trying for 2 weeks to write this. And I explained just that I had gone at that everybody was wrong and my own personal viewpoint of Christianity was the only correct way. And I need some more time to do it because I think I've had this breakthrough that I need to kind of reassess my own understanding of God and take kind of an honest look at these other religions. So he smiled and said, okay, I'll give you another 2 weeks. So I finished the paper, did get an A in the class. But that really kind of started my own personal study of these other religions. As far as my book goes, I ended up, as I would talk to people, even before I joined the fraternity, a lot of people have never studied these other world religions at all. They may know, just a little snippet or of the teachings, and that's their only understanding of it. For example, Hinduism. You bring up Hinduism, they're like, oh, well, they have lots of gods. There's yoga, meditation. That's about it. That's all they know.
Does that surprise you that a lot of Freemasons are not familiar or haven't really researched any of the other religions?
It doesn't surprise me. It's sometimes disappointing, if I'm going to be honest with you, because I think that our ritual tells you to study. And even though, especially, the craft degrees, the Blue Lodge is very much in the Christian tradition. York Rite's obviously also rooted in the Christian tradition, but the Scottish Rite, for sure, at least on the southern jurisdiction, which is where I'm hailed from. I'm not quite sure what the northern jurisdiction is. Their teachings are. But for sure on the southern jurisdiction, Scottish Rite, I mean, there's stuff from the Sufi tradition, Hinduism, even a little Eastern, Taoism kind of sprinkled in. So yeah, that's all, it's kind of disheartening. It's like you join this group that tells you that you need to look at these religions and that we're all under the brotherhood of man and whatnot. But you obviously haven't spent any time looking at this.
And I find your story very parallel to mine, where I also grew up in a small town. Everyone seemed to practice one faith that was very predominant throughout my life. When I moved out of that small town in Arizona to upstate New York and was introduced to another predominant religion that is up there, I went from being a Southern Baptist to being really steeped in Catholicism, and mainly the Roman Catholic branch of that. There are other religions, of course, but that was very predominant there. Massive difference, still Christianity, but just completely different ways of worship. That was a bit of a culture shock to me. And then it was one of the questions that was rolling through my mind literally as I was looking at my application to petition for membership to my mother lodge was, do I believe in the existence of a supreme being? And I really was like, yes, but I couldn't tell you which one. I think that there's this bigger thing than me, obviously, yes. But if I'm to say, and that was like my first holdup in becoming a Freemason. What was then interesting was and maybe you've shared this experience as well, during the first degree, I had asked, like, is Freemasonry a religion? No, it's not a religion, not at all. And I'm hearing a lot of religious references. Actual parts of the Bible are being used in our ritual. Prayers are based on that. The story of King Solomon's temple based on. So there is a lot of religion in Freemasonry. How do you explain that to new brothers or new members that are like, whoa, where did all this religion come from in Freemasonry?
It's funny. I recently probably had a 2.5, maybe a 3-hour conversation with a potential member about this, that I'm a Boy Scout leader, and we had a Santa Claus come speak to the Cub Scout pack. And after the kids had seen Santa and we were in the process of cleaning up, the Santa Claus said that he was from Guthrie, Oklahoma. And I just kind of offhand commented that, well, I'm a member of the Guthrie Scottish Rite, which Guthrie, Oklahoma, believe it or not, has actually one of the world's largest exclusively Masonic buildings. So he and I started talking, and come to find out, obviously he's a member of the Scottish Rite as well. And this other leader from the Cub Scouts just kind of had this odd look on his face. I thought, oh no, is this an anti-Mason? Did I just, step into something? But he didn't say anything. And Santa and I, kind of gave our goodbyes and went along our ways. Well, about a week later, that other Cub Scout leader messaged me and said, hey, are you a Freemason? So again, I thought, oh boy, here we go. And I said, yes. He said, well, I'm interested in joining.
Whew, sigh of relief.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, okay, good. So I said, well, yeah, but before I sign your petition, I'd like to sit down and actually have a talk with you about it. He wasn't going to join my lodge. He was going to join another lodge in the Oklahoma City area. So he and I sat down, and he had those concerns. Actually, he had some additional concerns because he is from the Catholic tradition.
Yeah, that one edict from the Pope, it really...
Yeah, exactly. Just an edict from the Pope just kind of undid everything. But so he said, I'm coming at this knowing that at least technically and officially I'm joining a group that I shouldn't be. So he had those concerns on, well, depends on what website I land on the internet. Freemasonry is either, just solely a charitable institution. It's a personal improvement organization, or it's a cult, depending on which website you land on. And so he and I had the conversation that, no, Freemasonry is not a religion, but it very much grew out of the Christian tradition, which, especially again in the Blue Lodge degrees, the building of King Solomon Temple, that go back to Judaism. But there are numerous Christian references from the prayers to the scriptures that are utilized. So you can't really get around that Freemasonry does come from the Christian tradition, and which makes sense because Freemasonry started as a guild. A stonemasons guild. Well, they were building churches. So, it just kind of makes sense that the ritual would come from the Christian tradition. Now, Robert Davis has some excellent books on the history of our ritual and how we kind of changed from an operative craft guild where we're building, we're literally perfecting rough ashlars and rough stones to be used for actual construction of buildings, to more of the esoteric side of studies, and we're perfecting our own, spiritual ashlars to become a more perfect being or spiritual person.
As a Freemason, I'm following along going, yeah, this all makes complete sense to me. But I'm just curious, as someone who's like, oh, I just thought you guys had like secret handshakes and like passwords. Now you're giving me a lot. And I feel kind of what, in what you've explained is, this is a service, I think, that we should be providing. This information is a service to brothers who are seeking admission into lodges, so they don't take the religion references or the historical references that, the Bible, to the Bible or events in the Bible lightly, that they understand that those are made for a reason. And it's not to really express one viewpoint, but it's just that this is where we can get a record of something that happened in time. And as you know, as a brother, it's something that is said to us in the ritual that all good men can agree on certain principles, no matter what band of faith you're from. We all can say, yes, the quote unquote golden rule is just that.
Correct. And that's one thing I always tell people again, that, you know, the religion that all men can agree. And when you start looking at religions, there's way more in common than there is differences. I mean, there's vast differences in maybe the style of practice, the words that are utilized for practice. But when you get down to the essential truths of religion, that, you know, there is some sort of a greater being, again, all religions can agree on that, that we should love our fellow man, you know, charity. Those are all things that Freemasonry teaches, especially, you know, even in the apprentice degree, the act of charity plays a central role in the degree.
Mm-hmm.
That's throughout every religion. Well, what's the purpose of charity? Is that I, as an individual, am giving something selflessly to aid another individual without, you know, recognition or fee or reward.
Right.
Because I realize that you are another human being in need, and I want to help you as a human being. And that's something that the fraternity teaches, and something that, quite frankly, the world needs more of, is just selfless acts of charity and love.
I've worked a lot with, in New York State, we refer to it as the North Star program, which is our way of guiding interested gentlemen into finding a lodge or helping them begin their Masonic journey. Because we all know the first step into becoming a Freemason is to ask. Well, first identifying that there's that need in you, and then asking about, hey, how do I become a Freemason? So I always tell guys, hey, look, you've already made the first 2 steps, so thumbs up, congratulations. My job is to help you get there. And in our conversations, I never ask guys, like, what are you looking to get out of Freemasonry? Because I know they don't know. They may have some loose research, or maybe a family history or tie. So some might be a little bit more familiar, but others, they really don't know. The larger questions are, they always want to say, well, you know, I want to find a purpose in my life. I'm trying to figure out, like, what does this all mean? Others will say, and some of my favorite way of how they put it are, I'm looking to make connections with a better class of men that are going to help me in life. I'm like, oh, that's a great way of putting that, because we all have those friends, right? But then we have those other friends that can help us get to where we want to be as people for whatever reasons. And I feel like that first part, if you really listen to the degrees, and as a brother, you're attending them, you're sitting there going, yeah, I am getting the answers to those questions as to what is my purpose and how can I be a better person?
Correct. And that's what the fraternity is all about. And that's one thing, that's what I ended up telling the prospective brother, that, look, you know, Freemasonry utilizes Christianity as a framework for the different rituals and teachings. But, you know, and again, in Oklahoma, and I'm sure other religions, during especially the inter-apprentice degree, there's lots of admonishments that, you know, nothing here is going to conflict with your religion or your own God or family or anything else. And that's the deal, is that, look, we're not trying to we're not trying to replace your religion. We're not even necessarily trying to supplement your religion. This is its own tradition that has teachings. And that's one thing that I noticed as I started studying and meeting various teachers from other religions. A lot of times they don't even refer to their own religion as, quote, a religion. It's, this is my tradition. And that, you know, even though it's just a different word, is actually really powerful, because it's saying, look, I'm saying that this is the tradition that I'm familiar with. I'm not trying to say that your tradition or religion is incorrect. And then I think when you drop the religious term, sometimes the guards come down a little bit, to where I'm not trying to convert you to a different way of thinking. I'm just explaining that in my, again, tradition that has this view of God and these teachings to become a better person. So that's just my tradition that I'm coming from. And again, Freemasonry is an esoteric tradition. It's not a religion. It's a tradition that has its teachings. And those teachings, because again, where it came from is rooted in Christianity. And one thing I'll say too, my lodge is very diverse. I mean, we've got Buddhists, we have Zoroastrians, we have people from, you know, neo-pagans. We have a very diverse lodge. And a lot of people, it seems like, from other traditions, and again, coming from the Christian tradition, I really can't speak to how they think or feel totally, but just from my conversations, it seems that they don't get hung up on the Christian aspect very much about it. It seems like, and I'm not trying to step on any toes here, it seems like most Christians get hung up on other religions than other religions get hung up on Christianity.
I've asked that question. I want to get to that, but I want, you said something and I'm like, I'm really surprised his lawyer brain didn't pick up on this one. And when you get into, because with a law firm, background, you get into the definitions of things. And that's what I like where you said traditions versus religion, because tradition implies to me that these are values, practices, morals that have been taught and passed down over time, correct? Where a religion immediately starts with, these are beliefs and beliefs are
dogma,
and beliefs offer, well, someone's right and someone's wrong. You right away, that's where the conversation starts, where a tradition is like, okay, I can respect other people's traditions. I can also respect other people's religions. But I like how you said, and it's one of those mental notes I'm jotting down. It's like, next time somebody asks, I'll say, well, I came from a Christian tradition and look at myself as embracing all faiths, because I don't feel like anybody really has the one answer. I just feel like they're all searching and seeking for it. The second part is that I was in my class where I was raised. One of the brothers was a Wiccan, and I had no idea what that was until we went through the degrees, because he had the various tattoos on his body, and he was explaining all of this. I'm like, oh, that's so interesting. And I said, well, brother, when you go down to the altar and we have to put our hand there and when we do the obligation, what do you say in place of the word God or him? Like, how do you associate that with, a religion that's based on many different gods? And he said, oh, I just think of, the fire god for this, or the earth god for this, or the elements that he believed in. I'm like, that is so interesting that's how they, and like you said, he didn't make a big deal about it at all. It was me who was like, how would a Wiccan go through this? How would they ask these questions?
And again, when you start studying religions and you go to what we have more in common, I think, and I always enjoy when somebody from a non-Christian tradition goes through the degrees and just kind of pick their brain about it. Like, well, what did you think about that? Kind of like you're saying with that brother. And most of the time they can relate it directly back to a teaching from their own religion. Again, like charity. Oh yeah, we practice charity. In fact, that's one of the pillars of Islam, the act of charity. So that's fine. I don't take any offense to that.
Right.
So yeah, I think most of the time Christians get more hung up on religion than other religions get hung up on Christianity, in my belief.
I had talked with a brother about the head wrap that Hindus wear. Uh-huh. What was the meaning behind that? And he said, oh, well, it shows that we live our life a certain way in a certain code, and that if we see somebody that needs our help or charity, that we are going to help you. And I was like, holy, yeah, it's a symbol of being a good person. I'm like, wow, 44 years on this planet, and I am still learning something every day. And that's the other part that I wanted to get to when it comes to Freemasonry, where you are already asking these questions. Obviously, you studied theology and the different religions. For me, having only been exposed to a couple different ones, I found myself through Freemasonry seeking out books on specifically Buddhism, because I started to see that there were a lot of Buddhist traditions that had made their way into some of our teachings, seeking to understand, being accepting of all faiths, and some of the other Stoicism, thoughts that that are present in our ritual. I want to get into that a little bit more when it comes to investigating the other faiths. As a Freemason, you mentioned there were books, but have you ever had discussions in lodges about the history or the backgrounds of some of these religions or traditions?
I know it's a faux pas in the fraternity to talk about religion and politics, but my lodge, we're a traditional observance lodge. We have education at every meeting, and I want to say that pretty much every education piece eventually gets the politics or religion. But again, we always our lodge is pretty close knit, and any kind of visitors that come in, look, we want to discuss these things. We're not trying to change your mind. We're not trying to convert you to a different way of thinking or a different belief system. But let's discuss these again. And sometimes, there's some disagreements that pop up. And I think it's interesting that usually by the next meeting, maybe two brothers had a serious disagreement about a religious or political topic. But after reflection, usually they come back to the lodge and they've kind of met each other in the middle on the issue. Or, hey, I agree to disagree.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's a sign of maturity.
I feel the same way. We're told, okay, religion and politics should not be discussed in the lodge. And I think only when those two topics are presented, if you study the words a little bit more, as issues that would be divisive to the brothers of the craft. As a lawyer, again, it's a little asterisk that I would look for. I'm like, well, I would put it this way.
Yes.
I think if you talk about the history and the cultural impact of religion and the traditions, obviously, that's going to be my word from now on. I love that so much. When you speak to those, that's on a learning opportunity. And I think when you hear more of this as a person, as an individual, when you're put in settings of other faiths and of other traditions and other lifestyles and values, now you're more educated on how to respond in those situations instead of feeling uncomfortable or looking around for someone to give you some sort of guidance on how to behave.
People, I think, are afraid of just discussion nowadays, where they're worried about, offending somebody or just making somebody angry. And so you kind of retreat back to your own silo that you're comfortable with, but then you don't learn and grow. Sometimes learning and growing, you have to step outside of that comfort zone and again, go talk to people and hear other viewpoints. I did a education piece last year to a couple lodges about like social media, that we all kind of have our echo chambers that we stay in, that if you're liberal, you probably get all of your news sources from liberal online TV, podcasts, whatnot. Same thing for conservatives. So you become myopic and that's all you hear. You never hear other viewpoints. And then when you hear other viewpoints, it's almost can become a personal affront to you that, these people are challenging me, they're wrong. But again, a sign of maturity, growth, and learning is, hey, I want to just discuss this and not get angry. I'm not trying to change your mind. You're not trying to change my mind. Let's just discuss this. And kind of going back to the beginning on, if God stuck his hand out and, describe the hand, when you hear other viewpoints, you learn and see things from a different perspective on that.
The book is called The Path: Using the Religions of the World as a Guide to Personal and Spiritual Development. We'll make sure that you can get the link to purchase this on Amazon and the other places it's available in the show links for this episode on the podcast. I would feel horrible if I didn't get to talking at least about the book a little bit. And one of the reviews brought up a good question where a reviewer had said that this is the ultimate spiritual self-help book. And we had kind of talked about, a lot of people from all walks of life come in seeking answers through religion to some of the bigger questions, like what's my purpose? How do I find true peace? Who is this God? And how do I connect with them? In the book for the reader, one of the thoughts that I wanted you to expand on a little bit is the personal psychology and also the growth that is going to come through what you have found through learning this and what others can as they explore as well.
The reason I call it the path, is about a guide to personal development because it's a process. And Freemasonry is a path. What's funny is I started studying these various religions, and when I would have these conversations with people who weren't familiar, I started kind of writing these little brief synopses of these religions, and I would just give them to people. And then that kind of grew out into the book. But the thing about any kind of personal growth in the Masonic system or other traditions or systems, it takes work. It takes personal reflection. And sometimes that can be very uncomfortable as well, which is one reason. And again, when I talked to the prospective brother, I said, look, the nice thing about Freemasons, and when you meet a fellow brother, no matter where they're from, like for you, example, you're from Arizona, you live in DC, we're from very different geographical and cultural spaces, but we can have a conversation and we're all seeking something. We all come to the fraternity seeking something. Now, some people may not have a great idea of exactly what that may be. Maybe they're looking for friends, or just a group of people to hang out with, network with, and whatnot. But we're all seeking something on it. And Freemasonry, again, is a traditional framework from the entered apprentice all the way, Master Mason degree, and the appendant bodies is about personal development. We talked about an entered apprentice degree, that's basically the foundational work. You're on the checkered floor of King Solomon's temple. You're working on the very bottom floor, the foundational aspects of your own personal development. You're chipping away at the vices and superfluities of life. You're trying to focus on what really matters. Again, the big questions: who am I? Why am I here? What is God? What's my duties to my fellow man? Those are all important questions that Freemasonry provides a contemplative framework for, that other religions also are trying to answer and seek out.
And I like the point earlier you had mentioned, looking at the hand, and that religion is really, if two people in today's world can see the same thing on television and come away thinking completely opposite viewpoints of what just happened in front of their very eyes, imagine the differences in the same story that's going to be told through different languages and different aspects of what their awareness or vision to that was.
Oh, yeah. And even in the Christian tradition, you were talking about, Southern Baptist or Nazarene or Methodist or Assembly of God or whatever, Protestant, even Protestant versus Catholic. They're wildly different interpretations of even the same text. But I think too often people get hung up. It's almost like, as humans, we like to find the differences rather than the similarities. Because if you start looking at the similarities, then your particular flavor or brand, you're worried that you're going to lose it almost. That, well, if this isn't the only one and true and correct way of thinking about this particular topic, or this political issue, or even religion, then I'm wrong, and then my whole house of cards tumble. But I think a lot of that's not a mature way of thinking of religion and God. I mean, if your vision and way of thinking of God is so fragile that to say that, well, maybe somebody else could also be correct, and that's not a mature Christian, or that's not a mature faith, whether it's Christianity, Islam, or anything else. That's not a mature faith. That is, I think in my book, I called it the God superiority complex. That's a very, fragile way of thinking of God in the world. That's not a mature way of thinking of God in the world, because I may have my personal way of thinking of something, and just because somebody else thinks differently doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong. They come from a different background. Maybe they have a different socioeconomic status than I. So they may think of a topic very differently than I do. Now, from my way of thinking, I think that I'm correct. And from your experiences and way of thinking, you're correct. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one of us has to inherently be wrong.
We can both be right.
Yeah, and we may both be wrong.
Right. That's also the other outcome that could happen. Yeah. I didn't think about that. Now, you and I connected in a conversation, and I had shared with you a specific part of New York ritual, and I'll just kind of paraphrase it here, but basically it states in our entered apprentice degree, the first degree, that, the goal of Freemasonry is to pretty much encourage Masons to trust their feelings of acceptance when dealing with men of different or of all faiths. Is there a specific part of the ritual, and if you have to paraphrase it as well because of obligations or ties that you have with your Grand Lodge or your jurisdiction, was there a part in our ritual or in the degrees that kind of spoke to you when it comes to the duty of Masons when it comes to faith or religion?
The religion which all men can agree aspect was really powerful to me, because I had already started studying these other religions and kind of like, well, we got a whole lot in common. So I remember that part of the ritual just kind of smacked me in the face that I think I found my group. We're gonna parse that apart and really dig into that.
And I wish that I had either you or Brother John Nagy, who's also a frequent guest on our podcast, who are obviously men who have studied religious works, because there is so much of it, like I said, that's steeped in our ritual and just how we do things as Freemasons. And for a lot of us brothers that maybe didn't have perfect attendance at Sunday school, some of that goes over our head. But thankfully, there's brothers like you and Brother Nagy and others that are out there that are doing this, that are helping to connect these religious symbols or lines or meanings with our ritual really reinforce the Masonic lessons that are there?
I've had lots of mentors that have helped me on this path and journey. And again, that's what the fraternity is about. It's about men who are seeking something. We're all seekers. We're trying to be the best person we can be. We're trying to make the world the best place we can be. And that's critical because especially when you can have mentors that have wildly different backgrounds than yourself, who grew up in different geographical locations, whatnot, just different viewpoints that we're all on the same path to try to understand ourselves and God. And it's great that there's people who are on their own journey and are willing to help hold your light for you when you need as well.
This has been the Craftsman Online Podcast. Again, I want to thank my guest this week, worshipful brother Jason Marshall. Thanks for coming on, Jason.
Thank you. I had a great time.
If Masonic education is important to you, you can sign up for our email newsletter. That's at craftsmanonline.com. A reminder that new episodes of the Craftsman Online Podcast are available for download every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.